welcome to Conversations with Thought Leaders. It's a platform we've created this year to connect community with amazing and inspirational thinking from all over the world. I'm also the Managing Director of Granite Consulting. So today we're talking about leading the leaders and what matters today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Alana Bennett, who's the founder of Connected Experience, and they help people connect and align to make organizations succeed more. I'm also joined by an old friend of mine, Tim Way, Managing Director of the Career Conversation. And that business helps busy leaders improve connection and engagement in the digital world. And so if we start to talk about leadership, and obviously we're here today to talk about leadership and leading the leaders. And Alana, so when you think about leadership through your experiences as a function of organizations, and indeed your direct experiences, what are some of the key themes that jump out to you?
Yeah, look, it's a really big topic, isn't it? Because I think, we all know everyone's written a book on it and everyone's got a different view, and there's such a spectrum of information available to us, and we all teach it in organisations and even just in life slightly differently. But if I think about my own personal experience and I think about organisations that I've been a part of, I think individuals that are leading well understand that their role as a leader is actually not about them. It's this idea of letting go of your ego, and actually your success as a leader is actually about empowering other people to unleash their full potential, and less about your role and your inadequacies or adequacies, as a leader. I think when leaders start to make that transition around your job being about creating the conditions for people to really become increasingly effective, help them realise their capacity and their potential. I think that's when we start to actually see this real shift around, particularly leading leaders. We move from that lens of just leading the direct team to actually leading the leaders of the teams. And I think when you move into that leading leaders, letting go of that ego, and it actually is not about you, but it's about your leaders, is so critical to success of an organisation.
And Tim, I might just build on that and ask you to, firstly give your opinion on it, but also with your experience from the UK, Australia, and indeed in Singapore, all over Asia, and I know you work for some big multinationals, or work with some big multinationals, adaptive leadership and doing it in a sincere and authentic way. Can you talk a bit around leading in different scenarios, and have you experienced pretty much, your DNA to DNA as a leader, or do you think these days the best leaders can sort of cut the cloth accordingly?
Yeah, happy to try and approach those. I mean, the first thing when I reflect on leadership a little bit is how paradoxical it is. I think it's really challenging, and I don't want all of my views to come through with a glass half full view of it, but I think it is, and personally as well. And, we want... we want to cut costs on one hand, but we want to innovate and grow on the other. You want to think high level and think strategic, but understand all the operational detail that there is. I don't know anyone who, as a leader, whose role hasn't got more challenging in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. So I think that certainly hits me as a consideration. And I don't think there isn't a sort of simple, a magic wand to any of that. I certainly think it's exhausting. And I look at that sort of busy middle of leaders that carry a lot of they do a lot of the heavy lifting in sort of organizational execution. And my own experience for a lot of those men and women is they're just exhausted. And the burden of that gets heavier and heavier. No one has the capacity to become an expert in all of these areas. So it's nice to talk about, we've got to get all the ships to rise. But it certainly provides a chance and opportunity for us to think about and explore leadership in a different context, because the environment, the context around us is changing. And I hope from that, it's how do we all sort of try and help people move away from, I've just got to get to Christmas, if I can just get to Christmas, breathe, and then I'll start again, that sort of survival of the fittest. Or actually for others that are, I'm 50, I've learned a lot, I've got a lot in my library. Can I hang on to the finish line, or do I really strip down now and sort of learn a different way? So I think there's all these things going on. Personally as well, I sort of feel them in my life and work. I think in your thing to adaptive leadership, we talk a lot about what's changing, but sometimes we don't talk about, a lot that hasn't changed. So I don't think whether it's Seattle, Singapore, Scunthorpe or Sydney or wherever you are, I think some of the core fundamentals about, unifying people, common goals, finding good talent, holding on to it, accountability and focus on results, etc. I suspect there's 5 or 6 that haven't changed hugely. But the context, our environment is changing, how we do what we do, where people are, what makes up a workforce, what's deemed valuable and where I need to influence. All of that's shifting. And I think that's, it's challenging as a leader to sort of find a path through some of that and know what to adopt and take on.
Yeah. And Alana, do you think we've seen a bit more, I suppose what I'd refer to as corporate empathy versus corporate competitiveness, where for years, you're climbing the ladder and companies can be pretty cutthroat political places, particularly in, capitalist societies. And so to climb the ladder, there's a lot of, you sometimes see, the less desirable elements of human behavior. And so that leads to a natural competitiveness. But do you think companies have got more empathy these days than perhaps they did?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's really interesting to think about, why that's happened. I mean, I think, there's even within corporations, I think COVID has forced even more empathy between organisations, that maybe organisations that may not have collaborated together because of this kind of people pandemic. But I think there's this real idea of now around leading with heart. And I think we've seen a real shift in the last, certainly 5 to 10 years around, it's not this control and command type style of leadership, but actually it's this really, engaging, almost considering that we're leading as a family, and what does that mean? And how do I show up, in my job if I'm leading with heart? And for me, this is, a real passion point around this idea of connected leadership, because, we know that when, I always say when you think about employee experience, one of the things that I think we don't spend much time thinking about from a leadership perspective is what's the emotional experience that we're trying to create? So what's the impact we want to have on people in our teams? And, I use this analogy of we've all had that experience where we hear that song or we smell a scent, we're kind of transported, right, back to that experience that we had. And people have this day to day in their work, right? And COVID will be that thing for a lot of people. People will, in years to come, will think about COVID around how they were led during this time, and they'll either go, oh, gosh, that was awful, and I'm glad that's over. Or they'll be thinking, wow, gosh, my organisation really supported me. I felt valued. I was led in a really great way. And so we can't underestimate the impact of, when we lead with heart and when we truly get to know people as the human that they are before the job and the task that they have to do, the overarching impact that they can have on not just their individual performance, but actually their mobility within an organisation, because their heart is more invested, in that organisation's success. So I do feel that there's been a real shift, in recent years to that way of leading, and certainly not, I don't think everyone's operating in that space, but I think people are understanding that that's the way that we need to, the way that we need to move.
Yeah. But have you noticed maybe, Alana, that I suppose when we go from an office-based world of a 9 to 5 type scenario to what's really remote, people are still talking about, we manage people on deliverables now, lead people on deliverables if it takes you 4 hours or 10 hours. But I have noticed in the last few months, we're starting to see a lot of back-to-back Zooms and diaries, and I still wonder if there's a bit of work to do. I mean, I know there will always be work to do around actually truly shifting people to leading people on deliverables, productivity, and a bit of the old world still, well, actually, I kind of want you to be there 9 hours a day type of thing. What have you seen a bit of that?
Well, absolutely. And I think there's a real tension between both ends of that, right? So I think the leaders that are exactly as you described, I want to see you to make sure you're doing your job. And then I think those that are kind of saying, I'm really comfortable that you're doing your job and, I'll leave you to it type thing. And there's obviously every shape and form in between that. Yeah. But I think we and as leaders need to get so much better at trusting our people. When we know that micromanagement, it helps very, very few people. I don't know many people that say, oh, yeah, I love to be micromanaged. Let me put my hand up for that. And I think as well, what we've seen through COVID is people have had a lot of other things to manage that is beyond their job. And so what I love to talk about with leaders is to say, let's talk about the impact you want someone to have, not what you want them to do. So I can say you need to sell 5,000 widgets, but actually the impact I want you to have is that our customers feel really valued and feel supported. That's a really different conversation. And I think we've got to really encourage organisations to be talking about impact and contribution, and not what you're doing, but actually the impact that you're having. And I think organisations that make that shift, what they're saying is, I trust you. I know you know how to do your job. Now, of course, you manage that within the right, kind of sandbox in which you need to manage. So if someone's stepping outside that and you need to have that conversation, you do. But I think there's a huge shift now to say, all those organisations that thought they would never do remote working, well, hello, you have, and your business has continued to run. And that's going to put pressure on leaders to behave differently, because employees, and we know a lot of organisations where they're surveying, do you want to go back into the office? No one is screaming to go back into the office full time, right? There's a real balance. So we have to change how we're leading to now keep good talent in our business, but importantly, actually get the most out of the people that are in our business. And I think some organisations are slowly making that shift, but it really has turned performance on its head in the context of where do we place the value of our conversations with our people.
Yeah, and I really like the piece about impact. I think that's really powerful. And I guess, I've been saying to people, when people say, you're going to go back in the office next year or whatever, what might it look like? I think kind of need the best bits of this year and the best bits of the old world. And it's somewhere in between. I mean, I do wonder, I don't know what yourselves think, if in some respects it might have gone a bit too far the other way, whereas before it was too far that way, and it's probably got to find its rhythm somewhere in the middle. Not sure, Tim.
Yeah, I don't think we fully know sort of what, trying to avoid. I'm desperately trying to avoid saying the new normal, because I don't really know what that is. So, but there you go. I've said it. I think we don't fully know the impact of that. I think people have got a personal view. Personally, I don't like being at home all the time. Full stop. I never didn't before, and I don't now. And if I needed a bigger exercise and reinforcement, this has been it. Yeah. But I think you're right. We'll find somewhere in there. I think, face to face, from face to face to Zoom is not necessarily that healthy. The underlying elements of just sort of connecting and seeing and physically being there, and the other elements that exist when we're, at some point, maybe the balance of those is going to change and go, what, the commute that was so bad, it's leveled out. It's nice to say I don't miss the commute, but I think some point that might level out and say, hey, I'm missing some of the other elements. Yeah,
that's really interesting, actually, because I was going to ask you about leading leaders and how style evolves. And then it struck me that if you're a leader and you've come into a role where you've inherited a team, and it's all well and good if you've met that team in person, but a lot of leaders on this call may not have met the teams that they're leading. So if you've got any advice, Alana, for leading in a virtual world where you've not met a lot of your team or you've inherited people?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I've got first-hand experience of this myself at the moment. I'm doing some consulting work where I've inherited a team, and we have formed our relationship via how we are all talking today, which is really different. And I'm European, and so I'm a hugger and a kisser, and that's a really part of how I make connections with people. Not to say that I'm going to go up and pash everyone, but I think there's this human connection piece to me that's really important when we establish relationships. And so what I have found to be absolutely critical is, one of my mantras is who you are is far more important than what you do. And so I start there. I want to understand what makes you David. What is it that makes you tick? And, what's important to you outside of work and what's important to you at work? And how do we work together to best, bring that to the forefront? I so often say to clients that when we start working with people in our organisations, we don't really give people any guidance around how to best form relationships and make connections with people. We kind of go, here, you're in the job, off you go, all the best to you. But actually, if we armed people with language that says, this is who I am, this is what you can do that'll get the best out of me, do this and you'll really give me the shits, excuse my language, then I think we actually are kind of setting people up to say, how do you, now that you know this about Alana and David, you know this about Tim, like, you know, how would you have a conversation then if you know that this is how you get the best out of each other? And this is the stuff that, you know, kind of isn't going to work for each other. It's a really different conversation, but I think we hide behind sharing who we really are when it is so fundamental to actually how effective we are in the workplace. So I think establishing some of those really core things around who people are as you build these relationships, it doesn't matter whether you're doing that face-to-face or via Zoom, it's all just as important. And you know, my own first-hand experience right now is that we can be just as effective and build those relationships. And I think importantly, don't stop being a human through this. And I know that sounds strange, but, you know, have fun with your teams, you know, make an effort to, you know, even if it is having a cup of coffee or a glass of wine at the end of the week with your team, is do a moment to, you know, the team that I'm leading at the moment, we call it win-win wine on a Friday afternoon, share 3 wings, and we just add a little E on there to, you know, have the glass with us to make us feel like we're celebrating something. But I think it is those sort of things, you know, what are you doing? What are the rituals and cues that you as a leader introduce to your teams to actually say, who you are is really important to me. And because we do that, when we do that well, we know that people feel, you know, really safe in their jobs and they can perform.
We might talk a bit about tips and tricks on branding. I'll just throw it to you, Alana. But I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was the reference that your average person through social media is now more widely known than the top Hollywood stars in the 1930s. And it just sort of resonated with me how far the world's come and how with things like LinkedIn, you can really get a message out there as well as in your internal business. So I might just throw to you, Alana, for any tips and tricks on, you know, personal branding.
Yeah, I was going to, exactly what I was interrupting to share is I think I totally agree with you, Tim. I think this is such a critical piece right now because what people are missing in from a physical workspace perspective is the corridor conversations, right? And they're really important, I think, particularly for leaders of leaders, because you want to connect with your leaders' teams. There's magic that happens because of those conversations around making the cup of tea or, you know, walking down the hallway. And so we've got to get creative about how we kind of reignite that in this virtual world. So some things that I'm seeing some organisations do really well is these kind of drop-in for a chat Zooms. So each leaders, you know, whether it's an executive level or a senior leadership team perspective, kind of once a week takes a turn at saying, I'm having a chat tomorrow 1 till 2, drop in, and they've literally just got kind of the Zoom open and share the link and people just drop in for a chat.
That's a great
and it's working really, really well. And also, and so doing that with just as a drop-in for a chat, but also doing it with a purpose. So, and it might be because we want to share a story. It could be because actually we want to have some fun. Is as leaders engage with that more than you may have, you know, like when the team were having an event in the office and you rocked up to grab the pastry and the cup of tea, is you've got to be far more involved just grabbing the pastry and the cup of tea in the virtual world, is because you're sending a very clear message about how much this team means to you, even though you're not there. But I think it's little things. And, you know, depending also on what sort of, you know, whether you use Slack or Yammer or any of those, is, again, as a leader, be more visible in the conversation, share how you're feeling, ask how your teams are feeling. You know, the more that we can be human and you know, show that our leaders are human, because sometimes, you know, when you're under another leader, that person seems really big and scary and quite far away. But actually just sharing that you're just like them, you're going through this just like they are, can have a huge impact on your brand as a leader.
Yeah, and just a quick reminder about any Q&A, please send them through, because I was actually going to say, Alana, you must be reading my mind, that the anecdotal aspects of leadership, whether it's in a lift or walking down a corridor making a cup of tea, that's obviously all gone for the time being. So, you know, getting people across things before, I don't know, a stakeholder meeting or whatever it might be, or a sponsor meeting. So, Tim, anything you want to add to around that you're seeing companies doing to help foster that human connection and leadership connection?
Yeah, I think, look, I think Alana's touched on a couple of examples that are there. You know, we're still back to I really, we're still back to sort of trust. You want to build trust. You want to, there isn't time. And if you're a leader, again, you're capacity constrained. I think for me, that's always been a consideration. Leaders look at it and say, I haven't got time to do that. I haven't got time to do this, And I think particularly working at home a little bit as well, there's potentially a little bit of tunneling. You haven't got some of the distractions. So people are sort of just sort of getting in and getting on. And that's sometimes the downside. The good side of that is productivity and I get it done. The downside is I'm sort of head down in that tunnel. So I think it's just sort of consciousness of that. I think one thing that I found helpful is different conversations. Sometimes as you're a leader, what helped me a great deal is sometimes I'm the coach, sometimes I'm the mentor, and sometimes I'm the boss. Yeah. And in yourself, recognizing there's a difference in those conversations and when to apply those to an individual. And they don't mean that it's all reflection and dialogue, etc. It can mean that you can cut to the chase a lot faster sometimes with individuals. But I think particularly in a virtual world as well, don't lose the ability to think about what's the nature of this conversation and what hat do I need to have on. You'll change your hats throughout the day, depending who you're talking to. But is this one where I'm listening and I'm the coach? Is this one where I'm drawing on my experience in more of a mentorship role with some guidance and advice? Or am I the boss? I think leaders have a fear of losing the ability to bang the table and say, this is what we need to do. And they still need to do that. They're paid to do that. And their teams want them to lead. So it's not about sort of losing that ability. But that's something that I've seen and heard mentioned and try and think about when I'm connecting with individuals. What hat am I wearing?
Yeah, fantastic. And so when you talk about identifying leaders in your team, in your business, I'm interested to talk a bit around, maybe Tim, we can start with you, how you would go through an identification process and maybe nurturing people. And then obviously we've all been in organizations where people want to go a certain way and it's probably not the right fit. And I think as humans, we don't always like having the tough conversation. I mean, Ray Dalio puts a lot of stuff out there around radical transparency, as he refers to it in his book, Principles. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about yourselves, but for me, learning to lead, having the tough conversations, once you've had it, you actually feel much better for it and you've been better for that person because, bad news, as someone once said to me, isn't like wine. It doesn't improve with time. So, maybe, Tim, you can speak around that because that's quite a tricky scenario, right?
Yeah, I think we're changing a little bit. I think there's a part of this as well as we think about the future that, leadership in its old form isn't the only direction up. Yeah, it's not just what good looks like career-wise. So I think there's sort of not trying to dumb that down, not trying to sort of, pour water on people's ambition to want to do that. But I think I think definition of leadership is changing. If you look back and, I've been on them, you sort of, you're leading 3 people now, Tim. You go on you've qualified and you now go on the manager excellence program, and you're like, great, And I don't say that in a cynical sense. I think it's helpful and they're good structures in organizations to have. But I think some of the things that we're talking about, it's nothing to do with you yourself being a leader of people. You can be an individual contributor, come to environment sessions, etc., and bring a lot of the attributes that we've talked about here. So I think we're sort of changing that and a little bit. And I think the career lattice rather than the ladder is helping with that. There's lots of other ways for individuals to contribute rather than taking the manager job. So I think there's that one element. I think if you're having more of some of the conversations that we've talked about, there's less surprise in some of the dialogue. Yeah. Where we talk about, and it's a sort of trend of moving away from a yearly career discussion. Here's your rating, here's your bonus number, which box are you in? I've decided you're ready now or you're not ready. And you're like, that's it for the 12 months, And I think we're trying to shift away from that. And as we talk about sort of some of the things we talked about in coaching culture, it's just more frequent discussions. So that shouldn't necessarily be as much of a surprise. Someone's own awareness of some of the attributes, where they might want to go, what they might need to do with that. And there's some great tools now coming in as well to businesses, that career pathing, the skills that they need to go and do. So I think, that the role of the leader there is not having to deliver the bad news, or an knee-jerk reaction, go, gosh, whether it's my view or it's others as well, tell someone they're not ready to do that. There's a different type of discussion, and it's being had more frequently.
Yeah, we speak a lot about leadership at every level, and it's really that's relating to the question that Elizabeth asked around self-driven teams. And I guess, Alana, if everyone's doing the leadership development, then ultimately the purpose or the consequence could be you've got self-driven teams.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a real groundswell now for this whole, self-managed teams. And there are some key things that need to exist for that actually to be really successful in organisations. Things like a shared responsibility of what that leadership does, that leadership role does. So, someone takes responsibility for recruitment, someone manages budgets, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to have a really good self-correcting mechanism. So when things go wrong, how does that team come together to correct it before it goes wrong? What's that mechanism that exists to kind of pull them in and say, we've got some data that suggests this is going off track. How do we kind of bring it in line? And I think as a team, how do they make decisions? What's the advice process that they go through if they haven't got that leader, essentially? They're kind of three things that I think are really core tenets to having really great self-led teams.
Alana, what's your view around organisation? How often do you see organisations that really live and breathe their values and have done proper work at developing them?
Look, I think organisations are getting better at doing this and doing it well. So they're not, to Tim's point, just kind of words on a wall. And they are critical. I see values just as critical as setting your business strategy, because that is actually how your strategy comes to life. If people can't connect with your values as an organisation and they're not on board that train, you won't deliver your business strategy in the way in which you want to have the impact as an organisation that you want to have. And I think it's okay to say that not everyone aligns to your values. We don't want every employee being suitable at every organisation, right? There'll be some that you align with and some that you don't. And I think that's okay. But the onus is on the employer being really clear around what does the values mean to our organisation and how do you show up in a way in which it tells me this is what good looks like and this is what bad looks like, because I think that's a really important from a behaviour perspective, so that individual can opt in or opt out. And we've got to get better at doing that for people.
Good stuff. Right, we're out of time. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Alana and Tim.